All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm very happy to welcome you to the second event in our series to inaugurate the Digital Scholarship Lab here in the Rockefeller Library. I'm Andy Ashton. I'm the Director of Digital Technologies in the library. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Massimo Riva in the Department of Italian Studies, who's going to talk about the virtual life of books and other curious artifacts. I've done a lot of work with Massimo over the years, and I'm really curious to see what he has to say. So I'm just going to turn it right over to you.
I'm afraid you heard it many times, what I have to say.
And it's always interesting.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Andy and Harriet Embassy for inviting me to be part of this series, and also for allowing me to be one of the first faculty members to use this space, because I've been teaching last semester here my course on Garibaldi's Panorama, and this semester I'm teaching a course, although under false pretenses, a course about Casanova and the world of Casanova. So we are playing a little bit with this wonderful space and tool. And many thanks to Patrick Rasley, who helped me put together. In fact, he did put together my PowerPoint presentation, because I'm hopeless with PowerPoint. So, but before we proceed, let me point out, none of what you're about to see could have happened without the active contribution of scores of collaborators. And first and foremost, my students. And the digital humanists from the scholarly technology group. Now, the library's Center for Digital Scholarship, directed by Andy Ashton, and with whom I had the fortune of collaborating all these years. And I must mention Ellie Milonas, in particular, from that group, who's been a real partner in all these ventures. I also have to thank my senior colleagues and mentors, true Brown pioneers, from whom I learned practically everything I then try to put into practice in my various projects, with results that, of course, were entirely of my own doing or undoing. And I'm talking about the likes of George Landau, Bob Hoover, and Andy Van Dam. So there's a great Brown legacy at work here. I've been at Brown since 1990, 91. That was a long time. And I would like to believe that my projects are just a small byproduct of this broader legacy. So a warning for those who already know me and my work, because I'm going to be a little autobiographical tonight. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the history, these 20 years or 15, 20 years of work. So we're going back to the history. Indeed, I'd like to start by going back to the very beginning of my engagement with computers and information technology. I bought my first computer in 1984. And needless to say, it was a Mac. And we're going to see now perhaps a little video, if we can, a little video that you probably saw many times, made an impact,
Some pictures of Macintosh. Now I'd like to show you Macintosh in person. All of the images you are about to see on the large screen will be generated by what's in that bag.
Suspense. Right, why don't I show you this? You probably saw many times, but because, of course, a slight change of scale here is the first thing I'd like to address, from the Mac screen to the display that you see here, and of course our new devices like these touch screens we'll see in action a little later. About 10 years later, after that day, the World Wide Web was born, and it is now as old as my oldest daughter, who is a first-year student at Brown. And my engagement with information technology and what we call nowadays the digital humanities began around that time, in the glacial age of the 14.4 baud modem. And for all these years, like everybody else, I've been playing catch-up, trying to keep pace with tools coming along at a dizzying speed with developments driven by a logic that is not primarily scholarly or academic. So this meant clearly a serious engagement with the new ways of thinking and reading and writing that these developments make possible on an individual as well as on a collective level, from hypertext to social media and beyond. This is my sort of introductory statement. But the venues where my projects, most of my projects have taken shape over the past 20 years is in a sense an extension of the Humanists studiolo. You see here two versions of it. However, all my projects, as I said before, were not produced in the solitary confinement of a studiolo. You see here the Federico da Montefeltro, a little distorted, but Federico da Montefeltro's studiolo in the Urbino Palace, perhaps the most famous of the Renaissance studioli. But in that peculiar kind of physical space we call a classroom, which over the past 15, 20 years has increasingly begun to resemble a lab, a laboratorium. The classroom lab, from the multimedia lab in the basement of the old Graduate Center in Thayer Street, where I first experimented about 20 years ago with a hypertext tool called StorySpace, to the brand new space where we are now, in the heart of the library. So metaphorically sitting, or literally sitting, over a tremendous repository of knowledge, which is both physical and increasingly dematerialized. So I find this progressive move of the media lab from a basement to, at the periphery of campus to the main floor of our library quite significant. I'd like to focus here on two of the most relevant transformations and their significance for my research. The power of visualization, from small to large and very large, and back to small and very small, from bidimensional to three-dimensional, and what I'll call the collaborative term. So to some extent, both are made possible by a progressive disembodiment or dematerialization of both the objects and the fundamental operations of research. Now, if I can find a common thread in all my projects, I believe it is this. In all of them, the challenge has always been to find the best possible interface between the physical and the virtual. The virtual side in my project is represented by the digital version of old texts and their material embodiments, books, codices, such as Boccaccio's Decameron. Next slide. You see here a page from the manuscript at the Bodleian Library that I chose for the homepage of the Decameron web, the website that my students and I built thanks to two back-to-back two-year grants from the National Endowment for Humanities in 1999, 2002. Go to the next slide, I think shows the Decameron web homepage. So good old times when federal money was actually available and for such enterprises. And next, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's Oration on Human Dignity, considered by many a sort of manifesto of Renaissance humanism. And you see here a folio of the 1492 incunabulum on the Pico Project website. A counterfeit copy of this incunabulum made in Lyon in 1498 is at the Hay Library. It would be an interesting story how to, we found out that it was a counterfeit story, but I won't tell you because it would take too long. But since the early 1990s, like many of us, I have been working on a sort of translation of the physical into the virtual, the analog into the digital. A translation aimed not only at producing digital copies of analog objects, such as all the manuscripts, books, or incunabula, but to transfer the virtual properties of printed text, and sometimes even the physical properties of books into the digital realm. This transfer has generated what I would call a series of digital incunabula. The Decameron web and the Pico project are two examples of that, two early examples. Incunabula were, of course, the first products of the new printing technology, by convention, books printed before 1501. The swaddling clothes or cradles of a new literate generation, as they have been defined. But if you like chronological symmetries, we may call digital incunabula digital objects produced before 2001. But the truth is, we are still experimenting with transitional objects, our websites, weblogs, wikis, etc., etc. It is difficult to envision a stabilization or standardization of our cultural forms and formats. So this is the fluid nature of digital media, and this is the challenge we face as humanists, I believe, but not only, unless we keep renewing our projects, our early projects, that I'll show you in a second very quickly, readapting them to the new formats and tools and interfaces coming along. All these projects might be obsolete in a few years. Perhaps they already are. And Kathleen Fitzpatrick, in a book that I'll cite again in a little while, has spoken of planned obsolescence. Well, I'm going to give you a few examples of how this transition from the codex format to a more interactive digital version has informed my projects. One of the great collective tasks of humanities research in the age of digital incunabula is indeed to transpose onto the web the structure of traditional scholarship. And digital incunabula, such as the Decameron web of the Pico project, aim to capture in virtual form the representational and interactive properties of physical artifacts, such as books and other cultural artifacts, as well as the set of cognitive operations that have produced them, and they have produced. For example, allowing old media, such that the Garibaldi panorama that you see later, 19th century artifact, also owned by our library, to be reborn and live on in a virtual afterlife. The Pico project, for example, we can move to the next slide, consisted initially in a digital and now also a print edition of Pico's oration. You see that here that the digital incunabulum follows closely the conventions of the printed text. There's really nothing new here, in a sense. Parallel text, footnotes, etc. Here you see, next slide, a more elegant and interactive version that we actually produced with the help of Andy Ashton and others, and Amy Doneset. So the most important change, of course, is not in what you see, but in the functionality behind it. Now, a reader can choose to visualize translations, incunabula, and footnotes, we can go to the next slide, in various parallel combinations in a fluid way that no printed edition can easily provide. But this is only the surface of what visualization can do, namely for collaborative research and publishing. More importantly, using the annotation system embedded in this interface, scholars can contribute to the annotation of this text. So I'm not going to give you a live demonstration, but I'm going to mention this thing. Ellie is smiling because, of course, the live is very risky to give a live demonstration when you don't have much time. But in any case. Now, an intermediate stage is represented by our work on another Pico incunabulum. And we can go to the next slide. The Conclusiones, or 900 Theses, that the 24-year-old enfant prodige Pico planned to publicly defend in Rome in January 1487, before a commission of cardinals and theologians appointed by Pope Innocent VIII. He was wealthy enough actually to invite whoever wanted to participate in this debate to come to Rome from all over Europe at his own expenses. Well, the 13 of the 900 theses were judged heretical by Catholic theologians, and the public defense was told off by the Pope and never took place. The young people was even excommunicated and was able to escape a harsher punishment only thanks to the intercession of his powerful friend Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnifico, the Duke of Florence. Now, the Conclusiones claim to reconcile all philosophical and theological traditions transmitted to us from the ancients, including the Greeks, the Platonists, the Pythagoreans, the Arabs, the Jews, the Kabbalists, the Zoroastrians, and the Egyptians. In short, Pico's 900 Theses are one of the most difficult and esoteric Renaissance texts to decipher beyond the competence of a single scholar. So in 2002, thanks to a faculty grant by the Computing and Information Services for Development and Scholarly Technology Group, we produced an electronic version of the 900 Theses, again with an annotation system. And readers can navigate the text using the table of contents. You see, these are the theses according to the different organization that Pico had. The little yellow signs that you see here are actually mark the annotated thesis. So by clicking on that little yellow, you go to an annotation. This is an example of how the page open up. You have the thesis here. In this case, a Spanish translation. I'll mention that in a moment. And in this case in Italian, but also in English, an annotation by a scholar. You can sort out the annotations according to language, author, and other. Readers can navigate the text using the table of contents, may choose to see one thesis at a time, or all the theses under particular subheading, etc., etc. But they can perform a search on the Latin text and can read the explanatory or interpretive annotations, etc. This particular Spanish translation was the first ever Spanish translation of the Conclusiones ever completed. It was the work of a team of scholars from Mexico, Spain, and Argentina who used our site and this in order to produce. Now it's going to be printed in a printed form, so you have here an example, both the texts in the Pico project, the oration and the Conclusiones, were two digital texts that has an aim, as a goal, that of publishing then a printed book, because of course printed books are still sort of a value, and we'll go back to that. Although I was not particularly, let's say, in agreement with this idea that the digital should serve the printing process. And in fact, I was hoping that printing would be just a stage. And in fact, we might be able to do that. But for example, just to mention, we had a contract with Cambridge University Press to print the oration, and Cambridge University Press did not want us to develop the site any further until the book was out, and after that, we'll see. We'll be able to, we want to go back and simply because a number of the annotations that we produced, that this team of scholars from the University of Bologna and Brown produced, were not printed. They could not be printed. So we have an amount of annotations that could live on only in a digital form. So in a hybrid form of publication. But the negotiation between the publishing houses, the book cost about 90 euros. So just to give you actually 65 pounds sterling. So it's very expensive, etc. The website is open, of course, but so the idea is now how these two things will live together and which one will drive the other. Yeah. Anyway, so in addition to providing a digital representation of Pico's original text, the Pico project, like the Decameron web, is an example of how new interactive interfaces can facilitate and promote collaborative projects by scholars scattered around the world. In this case, collaboration is centered around one specific scholarly mode, the annotation, one of those scholarly primitives of which John Unsworth wrote already 13 years ago. And so here you have a sense of how annotations as building blocks of scholarly work, and not only in the humanities, but across several disciplines, have evolved. I won't dwell on this slide, but we can go back to this if you have questions later on. So annotations are the building blocks of research, from biology to the humanities, DNA sequences to textual and visual corpora, etc. The point is how to produce the best environment for each discipline, and also to be able to collaborate and to make the most of this scholarly mode. As this slide explains, as we'll see in a moment, annotating is a complex set of operations that become even more complex on the digital platform. Because the transition from print to digital make possible our annotations to do much more and better than in manuscript or print culture, namely annotating across media. Let's go back to visualization for a moment. As I said, visualization is certainly a powerful tool which allows us to make the most of the virtual afterlife of books. So dematerialized books that live on in a virtual form in our environment. Such as this rare first edition of Giambattista Vico's Scienza Nuova, published in 1725 and acquired by our library 2 years ago, and now digitized also as part of a large number of items that the library is digitizing, and also thanks to a grant from ACLS. So this printed edition is unique because those editing marks that you see, and you can go to the next slide, were not scribbled by a particularly critical reader of Vico, but by Vico himself, the author himself. As the story goes, I mean, unhappy with the results of his work while this was being printed, typical last-minute repentance of an author, he would stand outside a printing shop in Naples, and every copy that came out, he would annotate it. So you can imagine an editor of the 1725 edition of Vico's Scienza Nuova, the task that this editor had to face, because, and in fact, there has been a printed edition of the 1725 edition of the Scienza Nuova, published last year in Italy, 2 years ago in Italy. And they had to check, one by one, all the copies that were extant. This is not a manuscript, it's not, but they had to do on printed copies the same work that we usually do on manuscripts. Now, but I don't think they checked this copy, because it's not listed in the list. So perhaps we have something here that could be a footnote, or could be, sort of if we analyze it and we compare it with all the other extant copies and all the annotations left at Vico, we could have something, sort of a scholarly and scientific interest. But so this is now to be able to visualize, such high definition digital copy of the book, put it on the screen and look at it and read it and interpret it together. For example, if this were a seminar on Vico, we could allows us really to travel back 300 years and enter the philosopher's mind. Indeed, to visualize and decipher the process of composition in which his thinking became public. If we are able to acquire digital versions of all the copies of the book annotated by Vico, we can, as I said, look at them, compare them, etc., and then proceed with our own annotations. We can go to the next slide. Give you a sense of the difficulty of this. I mean, this almost presents the same challenges that some manuscripts present. Of course, there are ways to, perhaps discover what's beneath, this erasure. Then, of course, the decision is, what importance do we want to give to the fact that, to those sentences that were erased? So should we keep them into account in a critical edition? Should we, sort of create a shadow Scienza Nuova prima next to the one that was officially printed, etc.? There is no definitive printing of the 17 edition, 25 edition. Well, and then, of course, we can do this proceeding with our own annotations. So, and this is how the work of annotation become really a multi-layered process. But so here is one of the points that I wanted to make by showing you this. Visualization does not only mean the power to visualize or represent objects such as books. We can go to the next, which is actually, if you can read it in the meantime while I talk, and try to help me out. It's in Italian, of course, but it's not just the power to visualize or represent objects such as books, but also to magnify, so to speak, the cognitive process embedded in cultural artifacts such as books. Now, there are many ways to do that. Speaking of books and the evolution from codices to e-books, one thing to keep in mind is what Joanna Drucker writes in Spec Lab. Instead of reading a book as a formal structure, we should understand it in terms of what is known in the architecture profession as a program, that is, as constituted by the activities that arise in response to the formal structures. In other words, as Sheila Bondes showed us in her lecture last week, if the blueprints of medieval buildings can help us understand the activities that, as we read in books, took place inside those buildings, and vice versa, reading books, help us better understand, how the program inside those buildings were actually was structured, worked. Extending the comparison, books could be treated as a kind of buildings, which require us to move around within them according to their structure in a cognitive space made of words, line, syntactical and rhetorical links, etc. The dematerialization of books allows us to experiment with this. And I learned this in a spectacular way inside the cave, when I took a cave writing course with Bob Coover years ago. Yet, we do not necessarily need an immersive three-dimensional environment to experiment with this idea. Another example related to what we may call teaching-based research in the digital humanities, when my students and I created the Decameron web back in the late 1990s, we imagined it as an extension of what we were doing in our classroom. Here is a quote from our second successful 2001 NEH grant application. The Decameron web provides a new interface between the conventional and the electronic components of humanities coursework, reading, group, discussion, and writing. It does so by reviving the humanistic spirit of communal and collaborative, ludic, playful learning, of which the Decameron is one of the most significant expressions in Western culture. So how is this translated into practice? The basic architectural structure which governs Boccaccio's text, a miniature society of 10 young narrators engaged in storytelling and conversation over 10 days, 10 novellas per day, 100 novellas, scores of characters, and an entire atlas of settings, etc., is adopted as the organizational principle of the model course and its electronic playground. Through hypertextually based communication and exchange of information, the Decameron web will permit the expression of the intrinsically interactive, etc., etc., etc. In short, students and instructors replay the narrative game of the Decameron in the digital playground that we sort of try to create. Indeed, we could easily imagine nowadays the Decameron web playground as a prototype of social storytelling, or even as a sort of, we can move on, Facebook or MySpace environment. I'm proud to say that we envisioned it 3 years before Facebook was officially launched in 2004. We didn't do much with it, and but as a curiosity, we are celebrating this year the 700th anniversary of Boccaccio's birth, and we are doing that by announcing an international competition and prize. We can move on to the next slide. I've called it the Boccaccio Afterlife Award. And on November 23rd, we will recognize in a special ceremony held here at Brown the best translation adaptation of one of the 100 novellas of the Decameron in any language and any medium, including Facebook or YouTube. So we are hoping for a large number of brilliant entries. We already received a number of entries, so we hope. So All this playful experimenting takes place in the classroom lab. However, while the classroom lab is still a self-enclosed space, it is increasingly becoming the place in which the interfacing of the physical and the virtual becomes ever more consequential for the way we learn, think, and communicate our thoughts to one another. So, the questions that I have been asking myself constantly over the past years are therefore, what really happens in the translation from Boccaccio's book into the Decameron web, from Pico's oration into the Pico project, and from the Garibaldi panorama into the surface application that I'm going to show you in a second, and the new Risorgimento website that we just completed. Well, I said at the beginning that I've been playing catch up all this time. In 2004, 2006, thanks to a third two-year grant from NEH, we were sort of dreaming about a new environment. And again, bear with me. This is the prehistory, I said. I would bring it back to sort of the prehistory of what we see nowadays. We called it the Virtual Humanities Lab, part platform for the digital edition of old text, part workshop for experimenting with new kinds of collaborative research and learning. And the Virtual Humanities Lab was supposed to combine a virtual editing room with the same annotation engine that we used before in the slides about the Pico project and the oration, and a virtual seminar room. So it was supposed to be an environment where you can produce, publish digital editions, while at the same time teaching them and learning how to read and to interpret the texts that are, of course, present some problems that are quite difficult from a philological, also from an interpretive point of view. But we never managed to realize this dream, although from many points of view, we're still working on it, or we would like to go back and work on it. Mostly because in 2006, 2007, there came a new challenge, the Garibaldi panorama, which was bestowed upon the library as a gift in 2005. So we'll move to the next. This is what the Virtual Humanities Lab is today, which is mostly a portal for all our projects in Italian studies. We move to the next slide and to the next. Here it is. So measuring about 5 feet tall and 260 feet wide, painted on paper on each side, so the Garibaldi panorama is an extraordinary multimedia object, a multimedia hybrid, I would say. Part graphic novel, part illustrated history, part forerunner of the cinema. It is a sort of archaeological specimen in which, embedded in a now vanished form of popular culture, we find the traces of a dawning information society, an example of how news and entertainment were already mixed together in the 19th century, as they are in today's infotainment society. The Panorama project shows the undeniable advantages of dematerialization and disembodiment, and as I said, presents us with new challenges. The Panorama's dimensions and fragility make it impossible for scholars to study and explore it with ease and without fear of damage. Indeed, the panorama has recently undergone, as I understand, the process of conservation and restoration, or conservative restoration, at a cost, can I say, of more than $50,000. Photographing the panorama cost us $20,000 and allows us to disseminate this, of course, in ways that are impossible with the actual physical object. So in 2007, with financial support from Brown alumnus and support and Vincent Buonanno, the library digitized the panorama, and the panorama's virtual life, or afterlife, if you prefer, officially began. The digitization was only the first step in a process that would culminate in what has been for me the latest and perhaps most rewarding of the series of collaborations which have accompanied and supported my work since the early 90s. So here, instead of showing you a video that you've probably seen, I'm going to show you a short demo, hoping that this will come alive and with the surface. So here you see a touch screen connected to and I called up, connected to the larger screen, and I called up one particular scene on the panorama, and I'm going to call up some, in fact, because there's a problem of calibration, I'm going to use a mouse, some of the assets that my students and I collected and linked to each scene of the panorama. So the digital version of the panorama allows us to interact in a fluid way with this object and without interfering with the physical object itself. At the same time, it's not just a way of interacting and visualizing full details thanks to the deep zoom technology that is provided by Microsoft that is behind the whole project led by the team of Andy Van Dam. So the visualization is a very important tool, but the most important thing here is that it allows a series of collaborative practices, including this collaboration of teams that are collecting and gathering sources, visual sources, textual sources, and they are linking them to, in this case, each scene of the panorama. So what you see is a wonderful magnification of the panorama. At the same time, we can go and even magnify and go into very, as you can see, look down at the paint stroke, or go back to, and we can do the same with the sources. A bit of this manuscript that accompanies the panorama. You can read it while we look at the source. And so on. But we can also use this as a canvas for collaboration. And this is what I'm trying to say, how the visualization and collaboration are actually intimately connected. Visualization allows us to envision new form of collaboration, a new form of publication, because this is a new interface for publishing as a canvas, as a backdrop, a number of documents that reside in the digital repository at Brown, and we can collect and link directly to an historical object, creating a cluster of documents that are specifically linked to the interpretation of this particular object. So the experimentation with the surface, although is only one dimension of our project, this experimentation led us to a series of exhibitions that we organized in Italy for 100, actually not the website, but the next slide would be a series of exhibitions that we organized in Italy for the 150th anniversary of the Italian unification. And this is a Sala del Risorgimento in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, which is a wonderful space entirely frescoed with episodes from the life of Victor Emmanuel, the first king of Italy. And the Garibaldi panorama, the screen, very similar to this, although as you can see on not vertical but on an inclined plan, was placed two screens actually back to back in the middle of the room. And not only visitors could look at the panorama and explore the panorama, again, scene by scene, listening to the narration based on the manuscript in both English and Italian, looking at the cities, or exploring all the documents associated with one individual scene in order to learn more about that scene, interact, as you can see, very popular among kids, which were the most eager of the visitors to interact with this object, perhaps ignore the rest of the room that was. But we also created an application that, in fact, illustrated the frescoes on the room. So basically, on one side, you could look at a panorama and go through you know, the story of Garibaldi. On the other side, you could look into very specific details and great details, zooming into the frescoes that you could see on the ceilings. And again, the documents associated allowed to recognize who the characters you see on the horse, or who what the various scenes represented, and so on and so forth. So there was an interesting, again, interaction between the material setting, the material objects, and the virtual installation. The next is instead a slightly, here you can see an example of what the original application named LADS, again produced by Andy Van Dam and his group, looked like on the screen. You can go to the next slide. This instead is the poster for another exhibition we had in Bologna, in the Bologna Sala Borsa, which is the public library right in the middle of the city, right off the main square, Piazza Maggiore. You can go to the next slide. And I did a little bit of scouting. We can actually mute that, but a little bit of scouting. So with I actually hid behind, you know, up on the balcony to film how people would interact with it. I was very interested in learning how people of different generations, a different kind of, would interact, and how much time would they spend at the surface, how much you know, in depth they would use this, you know. And I found something very interesting. That is that as you went up in age, and when you reached 30 and 40, people would spend maximum 1-2 minutes with this thing. They would play, etc., usually speaking on their phone. And but younger people, older people, as you can see, would stand in front of the slave screen. The screen was more or less this dimension, but it was connected to the actual interactive screen. As you can see, she's interacting with the screen, and the image changes also. And all people would stand there and did not dare to touch this, older people. But, you know, so students, and particularly, we can go to the next slide, young kids, and this is a school class, you know, probably 6th grade, were very interesting, fascinating. And of course, the youngest immediately understood what they were supposed to do. That, to the point that they wanted to plunge into that. And that's, you know, the idea that this screen invites, you know, not only to a very physical interaction, but also a sort of a projection into history. The fascinating thing about the setting is that this installation was placed on the floor, which is a glass floor, and underneath that there is an archaeological site. Sheila was talking about malls, you know, on top of ruins, etc. In this case, there is really an entire basement, which is in fact an excavation that goes back, I believe, to the 3rd century. So you can actually visit it, etc. So you would stand on several centuries of history while, you know, exploring, you know, this exhibit. Okay, so now we can switch to another, and we can go to the next slide. Yes, to another experimentation that went along. I talked about annotations, and the experimentation with the surface, with the visualization, the possibility, the potential of visualization for collaboration, is only one aspect. The other of the project. The other project was an experimentation with another software being developed by Robert Zeleznik and Andy Van Dam called Worktop, which allows the user, among other things, to link and annotate materials retrieved from the repository of the web. Here you see a project of one of my students. Actually, it's the desktop of one of my students. The canvas in Worktop has the same zooming capabilities of the surface. So in other words, you have an endless canvas at your disposal, which presents some problems also. I mean, this is where visualization is very, very productive on the one end, but presents some other problems, and I can mention them later. But here you can see he had sort of scattered his material on this this is a desktop application, but eventually will evolve into a touch application, perhaps, and will converge with the Surface application that you have seen. So this environment, right now there are two separate environments, they might become one. So you can see these are perhaps, there are clips from the manuscript. There are, some quotes that he found perhaps on the internet or in a PDF taken directly from the Brown repository, from a text, and some annotations that he created. We can go next to the next. And the fascinating aspect about this software is that it allows you to create a hypertextual cluster of all these materials as you collect and organize your work. So you have the scene of the panorama. This is a project about the torture scene in the panorama. There are 3 or 4 torture scenes, quite graphic scenes, etc. So the student was particularly attracted to this. At the same time, he read a lot about the debate in Europe at the time and the denunciation of the atrocities committed in the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and he started collecting a lot of materials directly taken. This is his database, as you can see. These are all the folders of all the students, the different students who were involved in this course. And so on the top, you see another very interesting feature of this software, which is being developed, still developed, and has made some progress since the time we as guinea pigs used it back in 2 years ago. The possibility of freezing your desktop at a certain stage. So, and go back to that as in a timeline and retrace your steps and start working on it on a configuration of your materials that you had sort of abandoned earlier. And so you can go back. This is a very interesting feature in terms of retracing the process of research, the process of composing, organizing your material, and then, of course, organizing a presentation of your material, which we can go to the next step. This was one stage of the final project of the student, who had this, as you can see, in the presentation mode, had these materials organized in a way that he could then, argue let's say the thesis that he was pursuing in this case, and which was linked to this detail that is absent from all the visual sources and the textual sources that we have. It was added clearly by the painter of the panorama, and is probably refers to an episode in the life of Garibaldi, when Garibaldi was actually tortured with this system. So it doesn't say that it's explicitly this about Garibaldi, but it's part of this. So he found an explanation why that particular torture method was represented in the panorama. So it was an interesting annotation on one specific detail of the panorama with a lot of supporting material. I mean, so he could have written an article, he could have organized all these sources into a sort of a linear essay, etc. But instead, he had, he could present at the same time his argument and visualize his argument in a sense by putting together and next to each other and linking and in a sequence all his supporting material. So we can perhaps go now to the next. Yes, actually, before that, we could. This is an example of some of the wonderful materials that are digitized by the library now. This is a journal, an Italian journal of mid-19th century that has been digitized and still to be explored, and eventually will be also linked to the Garibaldi and Risorgimento website that I'm going to show you quickly now. I think in the last 5-10 minutes of my talk, and we can, I think, switch to the Garibaldi. Here it is. Oh, yes. So this has been, it's work in progress, but that's where a website is both the product of the research that we have conducted with all the tools that I've been describing, at the same time around an object like the panorama, which is, you can go to view the panorama, you can visualize the panorama here, view the panorama, right. You can visualize the panorama and let it scroll while you can listen to, whoops, what happened? This brought us back to another previous, yeah.
Oh, I see. Like that?
Yeah. That should start the animation. You can listen to the English or the Italian version of the narration that is based upon the editing of the manuscript. So this, in a sense, simulates
Scene 1.
the original. This is, you can recognize, some of you
One day,
recognize
he was wandering on the sea beach, stopping occasionally
Peter
to
Harris,
gaze with delight on the
voiceover.
collecting storm, which
Okay.
presently burst with a crash.
Right.
It was an
Give you
emblem
a
of the
sense of the taste of it. So we can move to another, the research the panorama mode. Yes. So if the animation allows us to sort of simulate what the original probably showing exhibition of the panorama was, so present to the public as almost as a movie, you know, scrolling the panorama scene by scene with a narrator providing the voiceover narration, the commentary as in a lecture hall, sometimes with diorama type objects that would increase the verisimilitude effect and so on and so forth. Here we have a different interface that brings us instead to a more, you know, exploration mode, which is you have an image of the panorama next to the manuscript, the transcription of the manuscript text. So you can read, instead of listening, you can also listen, but you can read the full transcription of the panorama, because the voiceover is an edited version that we produced in order to try to, you know, also to guess the timing of the exhibition. You know, how long would they dwell on a scene, etc. The manuscript is a fascinating object. We can click in the middle, right? And here you can look at the manuscript and read the transcription. So, and you can actually, in fact, I already found a number of transcription mistakes, I must say. So we have to go back and using this part. So again, parallel text, exactly like in the first version of the Pico project, exactly like the conclusiones, etc. What we're missing here is the annotations. But perhaps we can get there. I mean, and we'll get to the point where this parallel view will, which is a more dynamic view, will allow us also to visualize annotation. The third mode is instead, you know, a mode which allows you to see some of the resources, the visual sources or the textual sources that which are reside in the digital repository and are linked by students who took in my class last semester, and so they've been researching the panorama scene by scene, a sequence of scene assigned to a group of them or to an individual, and they have retrieved through an easy system and linked some of this, and you can view some of the sources that in this case we go back. Actually, this is right. So you can visualize the source right there. I mean, it doesn't matter, but you should actually visualize the illustrated on the news. Well, why don't we go back to, since we're running out of time, to resources. Resources we have here is where this website is directly linked to the repository and to and at the same time provides a sort of a filtered view window onto the repository. We have portraits from the military collection, which has, you know, clearly all the portraits of Garibaldi, so that are relevant to our website, and you can view the portraits by about 30 portraits of Garibaldi. We have, and here we can click on read more about the Illustrated Press, an entire database of article and pages and illustrations from many illustrated papers of the time, courtesy of collection of David Kurtzer allowed us to digitize the news for this purpose. We have also, if we go back to resources again, and you click on the right hand, this format was actually, I think it was designed to provide an easy interaction also on this format to the tablet. So it's a, doesn't work? Okay. Something. Now that goes backwards. I want to go this way. So. That, no, not today. All right, today. Well, which again, as I said, this has been just. It was working fine until yesterday. I was up in Colgate and giving a demo, and it worked fine. So, but the resources actually are interesting because I was hoping to show some of the resources that we have, which are, for example, the great number of pamphlets from the Harvard Documento collection. There are 15,000 titles, which were digitized, actually, which were in microfilm format, microfiche and microfilm. There are some microfilms and microfiche. Thanks to an NEH grant, Harvard digitized, not digitized, created this microfilm collection. Thanks to David Kurtzer, we obtained a copy, and we are digitizing everything that is not available through Google Books from the art. So in other words, what we have in particular here are pamphlets and other type of non-book format that would be completely neglected by the Google project or the Harvard Library, which hasn't digitized any of this. So unfortunately, I see Ellie is very worried because it doesn't work. I don't know why. Well, the other thing that I wanted to show you is some of the student projects. But if we go back to the, I have some slides to back up, and I finish with that.
Projects after resources.
Projects. We can go to the next slide. Just to give you a sense of one of the projects, there were two projects that I thought particularly interesting, and I was going to show you the actual project, but perhaps it's better not to. It's available. This is a project that combines Google Earth with historical research about the defense of the Roman Republic, which is an episode that combines various scenes from the panorama. You've seen here the scene that I showed you before, the view of Rome, is one of the scenes that belong to this sequence. And what the students did, they actually tried to, this is a senior in Italian studies and another student, a junior, who combined the Google Earth view, overlaying onto it the historical map of Rome. And then mapping the historical map with all the places and events that marked the defense, that were somewhat related to the narrative of the panorama, but also sort of expanding on that. So you can see more or less here some of the views, including if you click on one of those yellow pins, you can visualize some of the documents that they have used in order to illustrate and reconstruct this slice of history. So through the application, you can actually travel to Rome in 1849. So you don't only use the Google Earth to sort of visualize spatially Rome, but sort of with this layer, you sort of try to imagine a street view of Rome in 1849, if you wish. But they've done that by using only documents, either textual or visual, provided by eyewitnesses of the defense of the Roman Republic. For example, Margaret Fuller's descriptions, or in this case, Auguste Raffet paintings, another drawings, another. We can go to the next. Horace Vernet, Auguste Raffet, and other. So basically, this is yet another interface, in addition to the one you've seen on the surface. In addition to the one you've seen before, the digital edition of a book, or another interface in which, in this case, we would be able to move across media and use the visualization capabilities of a tool like Google Earth in order to visualize a historical event and document it and publish, if you wish, in this format some of the documents that accompany this, the telling of the story. So it's a specific way of integrating the narrative of the panorama, at the same time sort of using the panoramic view, but using contemporary tools. It's not by any means perfect. In fact, there are some problems, but the potentials are great. We can go to the next, and just to give you a sense, underneath, it's not perfect, the superimposition, but it could become extremely interesting. And the format here doesn't allow, maybe, again, a better visualization will allow you to see simultaneously, the view and what's underneath. But clearly, these are adjustments that we can. Now, if you think adding annotation, and students have done that. They've done also in the final project included also some annotations to link all these different views and places in an itinerary through Rome in 1849 during the defense of the Roman Republic. So we can go to the next. Okay, well, I'd like to finish here since it's already very late. Yes, sorry. So we'll go back to the studiolo and the transformation of this, the potential transformation of this space in which we actually are. The lab, studio, library, music room, and if we can view the animation, this is a project that they have done in Urbino. We'll see that we are already moving towards. Actually, we can forward a little bit. We are moving towards experimental. The quality is not great, but an experimental, three-dimensional viewing of a historical artifact, in this case an environment. They created a 3D animation of the objects that you can see in the studiolo. So the carvings actually come alive, and you can listen also. It's in Italian. There is actually we could play some nice music. One of the fascinating things about this project, which is proof of concept, is not really yet fully developed into a research application, but is that you can interact with some of the books. You can open some of the books, and without even touching them, you can open them, leaf through them, and read them, etc. So perhaps this is the future, but I would love, if I were allowed to experiment in the cave with creating an environment like this, or even perhaps creating a virtual version of a book like the Decameron, and a real three-dimensional space in which you can enter into an architectural world, move around, and experiment with new ways of interacting with all the different objects that are part of our heritage. Okay, I mean the definition. Yes. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's late, I know. So if you, I'd be happy to answer any question you might have. Okay. So, thank you for coming. Thank you.
What about the archival nature?
Well, yes.
Because every couple of years, everything changes. Media changes.
Right.
So when we think archival, we're talking 100 years usually.
Yes.
And in the computer world,
Right.
that never happens.
It's the plan of obsolescence, which I was talking about before. I didn't go back to, but yes, it's one of those fundamental issues. I mean, the idea is when I was talking about obsolescence, I was thinking about my project. In fact, this project will be around 5 years from now. They're still already obsolete from such point, particularly my early project. But the archive, it's a complex thing. I think the repository is really where the immediate future, the present of our research lies. Because what I showed you about the Garibaldi website is that rely entirely. It's just a layer that can be redesigned, renewed, etc. But it sits upon this the digital repository. Or some people don't like that expression, the repository. They want to think in terms of infrastructure or service, etc. But what I was trying to show is the static nature of our early interfaces and how they evolved into something which is much more dynamic. And in fact, the fact that we have all this digital, texts and objects available to us forces us to rethink and reinvent, this kind of interfaces. So a website is something that's a work in progress, in a sense that, and that's a problem. That's a real problem because how do you sustain such a constant transformation? I think the Garibaldi website is a wonderful publishing tool. There is an entire group of scholars behind it that are working, that they can focus on certain aspects, publish certain documents directly from the repository. So a wonderful publishing tool for Brown, to publish what is in the repository with a curated, in a curated fashion. In other words, with annotations by scholars, etc. At the same time, of course, the problem is how we keep renewing that.
Well, but that is the way it has to be. So it's still true that paper, acid-free paper, stored in a cool place,
that's where
will last for hundreds of years.
Yes. Well, so I hope that the panorama will last a long time after the $50,000 they spent. So the problem is we can't touch it. We can't really touch it. I mean, if we want to relieve, the afterlife of the panorama, relieve the exhibition, the spectacle of the panorama, you have to use the digital interaction. I mean, because bringing it out. In fact, I was asked even by the president, why don't we, show the panorama? Well, the problem is that every time we take it out, it breaks. It's there is it's damaged inevitably. So and it's paper. So there you have a case in which this, because of the nature of the object, not just a book, but a more complex media. Although in paper form, that the interaction in a virtual format is much richer and clearly easier and possible than it is with the actual material object. So I don't know if that answers your
It
question.
does.
Okay, well,
Fantastic resolution.
well, that's not. No, unfortunately, the images were not so